Okay, good evening, Noswaith. Thanks for coming along on this, what evening is it? Tuesday, is it
Monday.
Tuesday? It's
Monday.
Monday evening, yeah, well, a long week already. Thanks for joining us tonight. Should be a fascinating evening discussion about the British and Irish security forces' role during the Northern Ireland conflict. What I'll do is briefly introduce our fantastic panel of practitioners and academics speaking tonight, and then I'll also just give you a little bit of a brief overview about the conflict, okay, because I'm aware that some of you this might be something that's quite new for yourselves. So we'll start to my right at the end is John O'Brien. So John O'Brien is a retired Detective Chief Superintendent, formerly head of the International Liaison Protection Section in the Garda HQ, National Head of Interpol and Europol. Previously a Divisional Chief Superintendent with operational commands, including those on the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. John joins the Garda Síochána in 1968. He's holder of an MSc in Public Order Studies. John was recently involved in an oral history project charting the experiences of the Garda Síochána members. He's the author of 4 books on policing and security. I see he's got a couple of them here tonight as well. A Question of Honour, Politics and Policing, which was released in 2020, and Securing the Irish State in 2022. And then The Troubles Came South in 2023, and his latest book on the Dublin Monaghan bombings, which if you're unfamiliar with, I'm sure we're going to talk in more detail anyway this evening, The Great Deception, that was in 2024. He's currently co-editing yet another book, Garda Lives, The Untold Stories, which focuses on the human side of policing. He has studied the period of the Troubles very closely, and his career ran in parallel with it. He's critical of the political processes in both countries relating to that time. So that's John. Next to me on my right is David Crabb OBE, is the Honorary President of Decorum Northern Ireland. He was a founding member of the organisation and is its first president. David served 30 years in the military on operations in Northern Ireland, firstly with the Ulster Defence Regiment and later with the Royal Irish Regiment, retiring at the end of Operation Banner in 2007 as the Senior Major of the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment. He served in a range of appointments in battalions in Belfast, South Down and Armagh. He is graduate of the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst and the Joint Services Command and Staff College. David also served in the Northern Ireland Civil Service in a number of departments, including the Northern Ireland Office, the Department of Finance and Personnel, the Office of First Minister and Deputy First Minister, and the Department for Infrastructure. In a varied career, he has dealt with security and policing, personal management, the International Fund for Ireland, and outposting, was private secretary on a number of occasions, including to the First Minister, and latterly was the head of coordination in the Department for Infrastructure before retiring in 2018. David was made an OBE in the Birthday Honours List in 2013 for his services to governance and the community. Next to me on my left is Dr. Daniel Chess, and Daniel is from the Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Liverpool, formerly of this house in Cardiff University, but politics and international relations. He completed his doctorate at Cardiff University on the Ulster Defence Regiment and its contributions to the British security services. Dr. Chess also has researched and written about the UDR, Ulster Defence Regiment, and the broader use of local forces within counterinsurgencies, including an ongoing paper contrasting the retention of local defence forces and the UDR in Northern Ireland with the dissolution of the Iraqi army following the 2003 invasion. Then at our far left on the table to me is Dr. Hannah West. So Hannah is a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Excellence for Equity in Uniformed Public Services and the Centre for Military Women's Research at the Anglo-Ruskin University and a Senior Programme Officer for the Female Veterans Transformation Programme. Her interdisciplinary research employs creative methods to explore military cultures and behaviours, women's military history, and counterinsurgency/human security. She draws on her lived experience as a former Royal Navy Air Engineer. Hannah's research on Northern Ireland came out of her PhD, where she looked at women as combatants on covert and conventional operations. She has since continued to work with former service women from the Women's Royal Army Corps, Ulster Defence Regiment and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, exploring their experiences of the front line in Northern Ireland to inform feminist retelling of the conflict. Unfortunately, we were going to be joined by Professor Hugh Bennett, but he wasn't able to make it this evening just because of health. So then lastly, myself. So I'm the network lead for this. It's at the very top, above my head, the very little top, little logo in green. So it's the long words, Island of Ireland Contemporary History and Politics Network. So you can just call it IOICHP for short. I'm a senior lecturer at British and Irish Politics Contemporary History here at Cardiff University in the Politics and IR department. I specialise on Northern Ireland Conflict, peace process and politics. My first book, The Intelligence War Against the IRA, was published with Cambridge Uni Press in 2020. I'm currently writing a book about how the Irish state has dealt with conflict legacy in the Republic of Ireland, which I'll talk a little bit about tonight. So, the structure for tonight is I'll do a little brief background on the conflict just for anyone who's unfamiliar to get us all up to speed. Thereafter, we'll have David will speak first, followed by John. They'll have 15 minutes each, and they're giving their views on how the British or Irish security forces responded to the conflict at its start, and then what was their input into the conflict concluding at its end. Thereafter, you'll get academic viewpoints from ourselves, and there's a chance for you to ask questions as well if you wish to do so. There will be a pause at one point before I speak just because of batteries with the cameras, okay? So just bear that in mind. So that will leave hopefully around 15 minutes or so for questions. So, brief background to the conflict. Hopefully this makes sense. We'll give it a go. So Northern Ireland Conflict commences in 1969. From Irish Republicans' point of view, they would have said the undemocratic nature of partition by the British government and also Unionist British Protestants from 1920 was a long-term catalyst. That would have been a factor they would have seen as key. Scholars then generally agree that devolved British Protestant Ulster Unionists, so Ulster Unionists meaning those who want Northern Ireland to remain within the United Kingdom, devolved government in Belfast from 1920s after partition is generally accepted by scholars widely that engaged in widespread discrimination against the Irish Catholic or nationalist community, whichever you want to call it. Civil rights movement emerged in the 1960s but met unionist resistance from political unionism. Intercommunal clashes emerged by August 1969, leading to British troops entering in Northern Ireland. However, this is my own viewpoint, there might be different viewpoints on this evening. In my view, they quickly turned on the Irish nationalist community at the very beginning of the conflict, really to try and prevent a two-front conflict. I don't think it's specifically because they were pro-unionist, I think it was to prevent a two-front conflict. By 1972, some indiscriminate British security operations saw a sizable minority of Irish Catholics join the new, what was called Provisional Irish Republican Army, we'll just call it IRA, to make it simple this evening. The Irish Republican Army and its political wing Sinn Féin believed that steps towards Irish unity, in their view, would best achieve equality. That was partly what it was about, but it was partly about they saw it as unfinished business since partition. Then just quickly with other sides of the conflict, Ulster Unionist political parties, we're talking about the Ulster Unionist parties, people might call it UUP tonight, and the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, want Northern Ireland to remain as part of the United Kingdom. Ulster Loyalist British paramilitaries, or Protestant paramilitaries, we might refer to them tonight as well, believe in the same thing, but they also killed Irish Catholics to try and stop the IRA and keep Northern Ireland British. The Social Democratic and Labour Party, the acronym will be used SDLP, that's what it stands for, and the Irish government agreed that they wanted Irish unity in the long term, but they wanted power sharing and an end to discrimination against Irish Catholics in the meantime. They disagreed with the IRA, believing it further divided people living in Northern Ireland from each other. A peace process then emerged inclusive of all sides by the 1990s. By 1998, the major parties to the conflict, including the British government, Irish government, the IRA, its political wing Sinn Féin, most unionists minus the DUP, which we might talk about this evening, and the Loyalist paramilitaries signed the Good Friday Agreement. So that's hopefully a bit of a whistle-stop tour that might help, might not have, but let's hope it has. Anyway, so I'm going to hand over now to David. He's going to give us his thoughts on the two questions. So, the response of the British security services to the start of the conflict, and whether you felt they were important in bringing a peace process in the 1990s. And I'll pass the mic. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's a privilege to be here this evening, albeit a bit daunting when I look to my left and see the academic rigour that has been poured over this subject, something I don't have. Where to start and where to stop is always very difficult. There's always been unrest in Northern Ireland since the formation of the state. Political and sectarian unrest, and even if it's bubbling under the surface, and it still does today, Still a beautiful country, by the way, and you should visit it. You'll get a warm welcome. I put the start of the Troubles in 1968. You could go back to 1966 with the emergence of the Ulster Volunteer Force. However, in 1968, as Thomas has alluded to, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association really started to come to the fore. And at that time, there was an international background of civil rights in the United States. You had student riots in France, and indeed in many countries across the world, there was the emergence of civil rights movements. So this was a part of that, but it had a strong edge. The Civil Rights, Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association started to demonstrate on the streets. They had marches. Loyalists interdicted these marches, and it ended up in street violence, very often occurring, especially in the cities, and especially in the city of Derry. The police struggled to maintain public order with all this happening. So right throughout 68 and leading up into 1969, an incident happened in early 1969 on the 4th of January, where a 4-day march from Belfast to Derry was ambushed at a place called Burntulloch Bridge, just outside Derry, by loyalists. And the RUC, the local police force, were accused of standing back and letting this ambush happen, where a lot of people were hurt. This led to a serious escalation in violence on the streets, especially in Derry, but all over. And the first fatality of the Troubles occurred later that year, in July 1969, when during a riot in Dungiven, which is just south of Derry, a man called Frank McCluskey was hit in the head, and it's disputed to this day whether he was hit in the head by an RUC baton or by a rioter's missile. But he was still the first casualty. That caused, of course, even more people to come onto the streets, and by August, from the 12th of August to the 14th of August, we have what was called the Battle of the Bogside in Derry. This was sustained rioting for 24 hours a day for a 2 or 3 day period. And the RUC, the local police force, had sent reinforcements up from Belfast. They were only a force of 4,000 strong. They were totally stretched to the limit. Despite using CS gas, water cannons, and even on occasion some live rounds, they couldn't restore order, which led to the government having to say, right, we need to bring in troops. Now, troops had been sent over to Northern Ireland but hadn't been deployed in the streets. But on the 14th of August, the order was given to deploy troops on the streets, and the start of what's become known as Operation Banner, the longest operation in British military history, lasting for almost 38 years. So, the troops went on the streets, not having a clue why they were there, put simply. They didn't really know what their role was. They certainly didn't know who the enemy was. But they arrived. And they arrived ill-equipped and ill-trained. Their steel Toby helmets on. They even had bayonets mounted on their rifles. They produced barricades up in the streets, formed squares. They were very much welcomed by the Catholic population, who saw them as standing between them and the loyalist gangs, and indeed standing between them and the RUC. But street violence was still going on, partly stirred up by loyalists, but also agitators on the Republican side who wanted to have a go, as it were, at the British Army, as Thomas had alluded to get back for sins of the past. Now, a little aside to this, to show how ill-equipped and ill-trained they were, they used to have to read the Riot Act. You've heard that phrase, I'm sure. Local commander would, if a rioting mob came to the street, would encourage them with his loud hailer and tell them to disperse, otherwise they risked being shot. To reinforce this point, they unfurled a banner stating this. Unfortunately, the banner was written in Arabic because it had been last used in Aden. And that's how ill-equipped the troops were when they first arrived there. So, as I mentioned, they were stirred up more and more because Republicans saw this as an opportunity. This meant that certainly the initial troops that were sent in, which was just the 1st Battalion, Prince of Wales Zone, totally insufficient. More troops had to go in. As more troops came in, as guns started to come on the streets, be fired at them, and so-called cowboy shoots to try and up the ante and provoke a reaction. They got a reaction. In Belfast, the army introduced a curfew in the Falls Road, not allowing anyone to move over a period of almost 24 hours. They went in and searched houses, and of course this totally alienated them from the Catholic population, and led to the need for even more troops. The General Officer Commanding, Sir Ian Freeland, went to the government and said, right, we have two options. One, you let me shoot rioters, or two, you send a serious amount of troops in, because we can't contain this. Needless to say, the government did not go for option one, they went for option two, and by the end of that year, 12,000 troops were on the streets of Northern Ireland. So that's how quickly things escalated. Those troops were living in squalid conditions. They were in requisitioned semi-derelict buildings that they could just get anywhere and everywhere. They were working 16 hours a day, eating compo rations. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase, composite rations, and not very nice, dehydrated box of, it's basically, anyone ever remember Smash? That sort of thing. Add water and, boil up. That's what it was. And we're eating that day in, day out. So you had very tired, very young, very disillusioned and very demoralised troops. It is no wonder that things did happen where mistakes occurred and civilians got shot. That's not to excuse what happened, but it's to put in context what happened. Because of the increased violence, the decision was taken politically and militarily, and if Dr. Hugh Bennett was here, he would go into this in a lot more detail, that internment would be introduced, internment without trial, to round up those who were suspected of being involved in the gunfire and in stirring things up. So Operation Demetrius was introduced on the 9th of August 1971. That led to, again, further violence on the streets, but unfortunately it also led to further killings by the army. 10 civilians were shot dead between the 9th of August and the 11th of August in what became known as the Ballymurphy Massacre. The unit involved was 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. You'll hear a little of them in a minute's time. In fact, you'll hear about it now. Because on the 30th of January 1972, 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment were moved in to Derry, where a civil rights march had been going on. The march was declared illegal, it was tried to be stopped, and it led to what became known as, I'm sure you've all heard, a Bloody Sunday. 13 civilians shot dead, for which the government has since apologised, said it was unjustified and unjustifiable. A 14th civilian died 4 months later. So that's how serious things were getting in 1971-72. After Bloody Sunday, the official IRA, at this stage there were two IRAs. The IRA split in December 1969 into the official IRA, the stickies, and the provisional IRA, the pennies. It was all about whether you had a stick-on lily or a pin-on lily to celebrate the 1916 rising. Matters not. The official IRA bombed the officers' mess at Aldershot Barracks in retaliation for the Bloody Sunday. 7 people died. 6 of them were civilians, 5 of them were female. The one who was military was a Catholic priest who was a padre. Following on from that, they were severely criticised, and the official IRA called a ceasefire, which they upheld. This just made the provisional IRA more belligerent, and they carried out massive amount of bombings and shootings right throughout 1972. In particular, we have Bloody Friday in 21st of July 1972, when 22 bombs were exploded, most of them no warning, or certainly inadequate warning. Bombs were exploded in Belfast, leaving 9 people dead and about 100 injured. The army said, right, enough's enough. So following on from that, 10 days after that, they decided to go in, and after the internment had been introduced, Operation Demetrius, no-go areas had been set up where local nationalist communities, mainly nationalist and Republican communities, although some loyalist communities as well, had put barriers up and wouldn't let the police or army enter their estates. The army said, enough's enough, we're going to go on the front foot, we're always on the back foot. And Operation Motorman was deployed, in which 22,000 regular troops were deployed onto the streets, with tanks, ARVE, that's armoured vehicles, Royal Engineers, tanks with bulldozers in front of them, and such like, assisted by 5,500 members of the Ulster Defence Regiment, which we'll talk about later, I haven't mentioned up to now, even though I'm wearing their tie. And it was the biggest deployment of troops since the Suez Crisis in 1955. Within 6 hours of Operation Motorman taking place, or within 10 hours of Operation Motorman taking place, the IRA planted bombs in Claudy in County Derry, killing 9 people. So the escalation of violence continued and continued, making 1972 the bloodiest year of the Troubles, with 479 people dying, including 130 soldiers. So that was the first 2 years of the conflict. What was the response? Well, the response was slow learning over a lot of years. The RUC had to ramp up their numbers. In fact, they ended up doubling in strength from 4,000 to 8,500. And they had introduced a part-time and full-time reserve of 4,500. The UDR numbers were increased by 4 battalions, and most importantly, I think, there was pre-deployment training for the army before they got over to Belfast, let them know what they were dealing with, including scenario training, including cards. I brought some along, game of cards. This was to ensure that every soldier knew what they were doing. The famous yellow card told them when he could and couldn't open fire. But there's also cards to say, if you cross into the Irish border, here's what you must do. If you want to arrest somebody, here's what you must do. So no soldier had any excuse to do the wrong thing. There was better welfare for troops, better living conditions. They rostered them better, moving from 4 months to 6 months, and 2-year residential battalion tours. Spearhead battalions based in GB to reinforce. They also had to increase the technological improvements. They're going to have to speed up and ramp up here. Improved radios. When the first radios came out, the IRA could listen into what was happening. They could hear everything that was going on. Not for the UDR, because the UDR radios never worked, and we always had to carry coins in our pockets so that we could go to the nearest phone box and ring in, and that's true, I jest you not. But the radios were introduced and better encrypted radio signals. Uniforms had to be changed to make them more flame retardant, because the old uniforms would melt and stick to the skin. Boots, sounds a trivial matter, but when you're patrolling for 20 hours or 16 hours, comfortable boots are needed, and the old DMS boots were not comfortable. Body armour was, when the troops first deployed, they had no body armour. So they had to go to the US, our good old friends, the US, you know, and get the flak jackets that they wore in the C-47 gunships. So those Army surplus flak jackets, that's why they're called flak jackets. They literally were flak jackets. And they improved over the years, ending up with composite Kevlar and ceramic armour, which literally could stop a high-velocity bullet, and did on many occasions. Better public order equipment, better tactics on public order, better use of helicopters and of aerial surveillance, more reliable and better armoured vehicles, electronic countermeasures. As the IRA upped their game, as they changed their tactics, they introduced things like radio-controlled bombs. So the electronic countermeasures you were effectively jamming devices on different wavelengths to jam the signal to ensure those bombs couldn't go off. Search equipment, such things as detecting buried wires and things like that, were introduced. The list goes on, my time doesn't. But one of the key aspects of the learning was, and this is where Thomas's expertise comes in, was a better focus on intelligence gathering. Because if this war was going to be prosecuted successfully, you needed to try and be one step ahead. We never were one step ahead of the IRA, but you had to try and be as far as possible. And the way to do that was through better intelligence. And we could talk all night about how that was or wasn't achieved, but we probably don't have time. So I think my 20 minutes now is up. Apologies for that. That's a very, very quick skate over the rise, but I think it's important to focus on those early years, to lay the context down for what went on and how it needed to be improved from, and how it went on from there. Very, very quickly, second part of the question was, how important do you feel the security forces were in leading the peace process? Put simply, vital. You could not have had a peace process without creating the conditions in which political purchase could take place, and to prove to the community in general that you can have normal policing. So the more you scale down the terrorist campaign, the more normal policing could take hold. And when people started to see that that could happen, that gave a genuine opportunity for politics to take force, albeit recognising that it was a nil-sum game and there would be no victory on either side, and there was no victory on either side. And also, it provided the government with a useful bargaining chip when it came to negotiations. Obviously, they had to look at de-escalation, and that was played in the talks, including the Good Friday Agreement, Weston Park, and various other things, to say, right, if you do this, we will de-escalate, we will take down towers, we will reduce troop numbers and things like that. So they were a crucial part of the peace process. I've banged on enough, sorry.
Great. Thanks so much. So thanks so much, David, for that. It was super interesting. And we'll hand over to John O'Brien, who will tell us his thoughts from the southern side of the border. John, thanks.
Thomas, thank you very much. Really appreciate having 15 minutes to discuss the Irish Troubles, which didn't start in 1968, it started in 1922. If you want to go back far enough to that march, but you'll hear marching bands and drums. My career in the GW4, the Irish Police and Security Service, commenced in 1968, so in common with my friend, our experience of the Troubles is different, but the time continuum is the same. Now, by the way, the Troubles aren't quite over yet. It's a continuum, it runs on in a different edition. By the way, I should say I'm delighted to be here in Cardiff this evening. I'm not going to talk about rugby and any of that sort of stuff, but it's a pleasure to be here. I had a ringside seat to the Troubles, because obviously the major conflict was in the north and in the mainland, as you folks refer to it as, and also in Europe, but also the propaganda war was fought 3,000 miles to the west, with the American influence on the outcome was enormous. And I'll just return to that, but just very quickly. By the way, what I'm looking forward to is your questions, because I had no idea, you said the first rule of speaking is to know your audience. Now, I have no idea who you are. So what I'm going to do is offer you the advantage of asking me the questions rather than me trying to anticipate every single item that may interest you. And, hopefully you'll have time for that. The ringside seat meant that in the Republic of Ireland, I saw bombing, shootings, murders, prison escapes, prison riots, bank raids, street riots, General Assaulter, mother of British Ambassador, mother of Lord Mountbatten, and being personally shot by the Provisional IRA on the border as an unarmed uniformed police sergeant in 1979. I saw hunger strikes, I saw many demonstrations in Dublin and other parts, I saw real climate of fear in the south. There was many successes against the provisionals, I know, because the IRA, Provisional IRA, Official IRA, Irish National Liberation Army, all spawned other individuals like Dominic McGlinchey, guys who were psychopaths and killers, had emerged from that same warp and weave in the 70s, so has been described. In the GW4, I served as as a PC plot for a number of years, and then had command experience doing along the border and a lot of operation with the IOC. I visited every single police training establishment in the United Kingdom at one stage, so I have a passing knowledge of what happens here. However, for the benefit of this evening, I've selected two specific studies, hopefully will answer some of the questions that Thomas has very kindly posed. And it is just, but the other thing that I want to say is one should always be aware of the casualties on all sides of imaginary lines, but I'm well aware of the 3,500 plus casualties in Northern Ireland. I'm well aware of the trilogy written by Colin Breen, a former IOC officer, where he describes the day-to-day lives of ordinary IOC officers. It's well worth reading for anybody who just wants to see what it's like. Now, we have our own story, and as Thomas said, I'm deeply involved in our own history. Don't have time this evening for it. Thomas very kindly, two questions: response to Irish security to the Troubles, and how important was the response to the 1998 that security response to the Good Friday Agreement? I'm just reminding myself the IRA, in its different editions, were the enemy to both states, not just the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland. They were all, and also the Ulster UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, was an enemy to both states. So it's quite important that this is not a one-dimensional struggle. Yeah? I'm going to answer the question without giving you the evidence, so that's why I wanted to ask questions. I think that the Irish economy in the south preserved the security of the Irish Republic. The threat to us was internal. And when the discussion in the narrative often flows, there isn't a great understanding. I can understand why there isn't a great understanding, but the threat to our institutions from 1922 forward, and I'm just going to touch on some of those. But I mentioned I was going to look at two case studies. One is the Dublin and Monaghan bombings of 1974. 34 people were murdered in Dublin and in Monaghan that day by car bombs. And the other one that I'm going to look at is probably more topical in people's minds right now. That's the Omagh bombings of the 15th of August 1998, where 29 people were murdered in Omagh and 2 unborn children. But there was another aspect to the conflict as well. We'll return to that in a minute. But just to give you a handle, which I use myself, is in the policing circles, we were trying to endeavour, who did it. We say we want to know what the motive, opportunity and means are. I call it MOM. Yeah? So if you look at any of the participants in this engagement, whether they're security, politicians, terrorists, whatever, it's very easy to get a handle on it when you do motive, opportunity and means. What did they hope to gain? What were the situations? What was the situation in the country that allowed it to happen? And did they have the means of doing it? Yeah? I mean, intent is one thing, but if you can execute, it's a waste of time. Anyway, just to set the context, back to the 1970s, the British Army employed well over 20,000 soldiers in Northern Ireland. The RUC at the start had about 4,000 officers, I think about 1,500 reserve. They were policing, and it's very important to get this point across, a divided society. It's extraordinarily important to do that because it has a context that I can explain if it needs explanation. In the south of the Republic of Ireland, the Garda strength in 1969 was all of 6,500 all ranks. And the Irish Army was 10,000. Now just hold in your head those two floating figures to get an idea of how each part of that jurisdiction of that island of Ireland was in a position to deal with an emerging terrorist threat. Big difference though. In the south, we were largely, not totally, a consensual society. We believed more or less in the rule of law. Not everybody agreed with me when I wore a blue uniform, but there was a basic adherence to the idea that we had a common constitution, that we had an integrity and a unity in that regard. I just want to mention something which is often forgotten is, when all of the military and police activity was happening on the ground, north, south and east, the British government established from about 1972 on what's largely called back channels. Even right through the most horrendous time of the Troubles, the British government through MI6, through other agencies, were talking to the IRA, to the provisional IRA, Those meetings are well documented, both in Northern Ireland and in Westminster and in London at different spots. So there's been a continuous back channel talk, right through the H blocks, which some of you probably weren't born then, but it's the most dramatic time in the history of Ireland because it inflamed public opinion. This is the key part. The intelligence war, I have a little chart which I'm not going to describe to you, but the security apparatus of the British state, by comparison with, where's it, that Republic of Ireland, a little small dot up there, and, well, not small, the white dot up there and that, was just enormous. GCHQ, the ability to monitor telecommunications, all kinds of surveillance activities, MI5, MI6, when you break it down in Northern Ireland, the Force Research Unit, 14 Intelligence Battalion, enormous resources, huge resources. So when you talk about a 30-year war or a 30-year conflict, you must ask yourself, why with all of these resources it wasn't possible? Great progress was made, but the progress was an imperfect peace, and I suppose that's about as much as we can aim for, but a huge part of it. Now, just want to return to the two bits I mentioned at the start. Before I do, from 1922 to 1970, there was a security playbook, north and south of the border. Even though both political regimes were totally opposed to each other and took liberal stripes off the north off the south and south off the north on their province. But when they were faced with emergencies that couldn't be dealt with under the normal civil criminal law, the first thing they did was to declare a state of emergency. And that allowed them to introduce special powers, emergency legislation, and ultimately internment without trial. That was referred to as earlier on, the one in 1972. But the rub is this: after Bloody Sunday 1972, 30 people murdered in Derry by the parachute regiment, denied for many years, and eventually acknowledged. Public opinion, political opinion in the Republic simply would not allow the government or any political party to introduce internment. So we had that facility up to 1970, but because in a democratic society, sometimes it is impossible to do what otherwise would be technically efficiently. And you have a view, people should be stronger, but I tell you, having lived and worked in the capital city for much of this, it would have been absolutely impossible to do. I mean, I was stationed in Dublin in 1972 when just after Bloody Sunday, British Embassy in Dublin was burned down over 3 days. Appalling. No embassy of a sovereign country in another country should be, but the emotion that you should see there, and I know the North are well aware of the emotion at rights, but it was palpable. It was absolutely palpable. And that was revisited 10 years later with the H blocks and all of that. So these are the kind of pivot points in every argument. But let me return to the two studies, and I do hope you're writing down a few questions for later on, because I can't possibly go to where I'd like to go. By the way, that's the book of 100 years of Irish police security in the Irish States. Again, it's anyway 15 minutes, doesn't quite get there. But case studies: Dublin bombings of 1974-34 murder. Political context: power sharing had been introduced in the North. It was after the Sunningdale Agreement, a pivotal moment. Major demonstrations in the North was brought to a standstill as a result of the demonstrations. And on that day, 17 May 1974, 3 cars were stolen or acquired in Belfast, driven to Dublin, and they were exploded at 5:30 between 4 minutes in the centre of Dublin, a busy Friday, beautiful afternoon. An hour later, a car that was stolen just across the border from Monaghan was driven into Monaghan and exploded in Monaghan. Now, the key thing in this is a cross-border crime. And cross-border crime raised cross-border jurisdiction issues. In this case, the perpetrators of the suspects were unknown, and probably with some collusion as well, because the explosives used in Dublin were of a particular kind that generally weren't available to anyone other than the provisional IRA. And I can hear you saying, but that obviously means the provisional IRA did it. But if you're listening to the Red Lieutenant Colonel George Stiles, he was the Chief Ordnance Officer of the British Army in Belfast in the 1970s, and he said that at that stage the provisional IRA had developed an explosive called ANFO, ammonium nitrate fluoride. Sounds a bit like an explosive, but it was a particular kind of mix. But he also said the other thing is that thousands of pounds of that handful was being recovered in Belfast and the other 3 brigade areas in Northern Ireland at the time. He said, we kept no logs, we kept no records of how it was disposed of. He also said something very interesting, and it's in my other book there. He said that if I was asked, should we get off the bank tonight to eat an operation? Something like that. And George Stein's wonderful autobiography said, of course I could see nothing wrong with it. It was to produce a result. So, the car bombs used in Dublin were of a technical, explosive nature, non-available generally, and inevitably the people involved had some help in doing it. Now, people will dispute it, and we could do this certainly, push-pull arguments are no use in the equation, but it's very important. The overwhelming of the 15th of August 1998, 29 people were murdered that day in Oman, and 2 unborn babies were also killed. Dreadful crime. The context, a little remotely, is the Good Friday Agreement, the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. The real IRA, which were a fragment of the provisional IRA, had broken away, and they were determined to bring this thing down. And that was the idea. Now, they had a number of bomb attacks, as David will know, previously into the north, and they were absolutely determined. Now, the perpetrators in this case were living, born, and bred in the Irish Republic. The car that was used in Oman was stolen in the Irish Republic. The people involved who drove to Oman were from the Irish Republic. Nobody has ever been convicted, but there has been one trial, and there's been a civil trial in Belfast in relation to the people involved. Again, the same dynamics apply. Cross-border crime, cross-border jurisdiction issues. There is a book available, it's called Black Operations, I don't know if it's available in the United Kingdom, you should read it, because in that they give, and this is written from the southern side, the numbers, telephone numbers that were used, the contact points that were made, and that comes from different court hearings that were held in Dublin. So the information about Oman, as to who was involved, how they did, is absolutely known. There is no unknown knowns in relation to that. But again, cross-border, for both of those events, in modern policing, what should happen is both jurisdictions would form something called a joint investigation team, JIT, where they would have equivalent powers to investigate and collate their information. But standing in the way of that, sometimes the politicians, sometimes the law, and as a result of that, both in 1974 and 1998, some very bad people got away with some terrible deeds. I do hope you have some questions later on, because I think I exhausted my 10 times. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Next up, we'll go for academic reflections, and we'll start with Hannah.
Super. Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you all here, so thanks for turning up. I'm going to reflect in this first question about how did the British security forces respond to the start of the conflict, specifically looking at how service women were involved in the conflict from the start. And I wanted to share with you a quote from someone that I interviewed who was involved in covert operations during the campaign, because I think it's, well, you'll see. So he told me, soon after the establishment of the Special Reconnaissance Unit, which is one of these covert units, in fact, that John already mentioned, it became recognised that female operators were required, or at least a source of women able to work on surveillance tasks in the short term. Trying to pass off a male operator as a woman on a static surveillance task had been attempted, but it had obvious disadvantages. Women, largely police women, were used on occasion until female soldiers could be selected and trained. So what he's saying is that they dressed up, men dressed up as women to do static surveillance tasks, but as he mentioned, it had some obvious disadvantages. There was a need for service women in this context. They recognised quite early on And it's interesting because I look at Northern Ireland in the context of British counter-insurgency campaigns. So I've also looked at the Malaya emergency in the 1950s and Afghanistan more contemporary operation. And in both of those, the realisation that there was a need to engage with women, particularly in Afghanistan, although there was a lot of rhetoric around it in terms of the intervention in the first place, actual engagement with women on the ground took almost a decade. So the fact that this need was recognised really early in the campaign is quite interesting. But it does follow similar lines to the kind, so it doesn't seem to matter what campaign you look at, the more I've been involved with, you can usually guess that is going to be searching, that is going to be the initial reason why women are needed. And that was definitely the case in Northern Ireland. It was realised that weapons and things were being transported either under women's clothing or in prams, things like this, which meant that you needed to be able to search women, and it was deemed sort of more appropriate to be searching women, obviously, with service women. So there was this early recognition that there was need for service women to fulfil this role. There were small numbers of women in the Royal Air Force, the Women's Royal Army Corps, and also the Women's Royal Naval Service at the time. These were all before women were integrated, so in the 70s and 80s, before women were integrated into the mainstream UK armed forces. They had their own women's services. So women were present in very small numbers in Northern Ireland, more in terms of the Women's Royal Army Corps. And so there was a sort of look around for, right, we need some service women to do this searching. Who could do this? And they looked to those organisations initially. But they weren't in sufficient numbers to fulfil the role. So there was an amendment to the Ulster Defence Regiment Bill, which was the parliamentary bill that set up the need for the Ulster Defence Regiment. And in 1973 there was an amendment to that bill which included service women being able to form a part of the Ulster Defence Regiment. And something I always say is that, so obviously as Thomas mentioned, I have a military background, but not from Northern Ireland. And I went out to interview women from the Royal Ulster Constabulary as well, so the police, the Ulster Defence Regiment, and women from the Women's Royal Army Corps. And despite having a military background, I think initially I thought I would find their stories tell me about more kind of clerical roles, support roles, these kind of things. And from the very first interview onwards, I was struck by these stories of being on the front line, being very much on patrol, kind of day and night, and being shot at, being targeted. And so it was really apparent to me that they were most definitely on the front line from this really early stage. And I'll maybe come back to that when I talk about legacies and the sort of second question. But in terms of, if I go back to this need for service women, there was a need for them as searchers, but other things they were needed for as well, and we see this in other campaigns. Here in the context of Northern Ireland, I tend to talk about questioners and also as decoys, but basically we're talking more kind of covert roles relating to intelligence, so either being able to debrief people and to sort of paraphrase some British Army reports from the time which said how effective women were at being able to debrief men in these situations, because they were seen to kind of set them more at ease, and therefore it was easier for them to pursue certain lines of questioning. So that was seen as very effective and something that continued. And then the decoys point is about being able to blend in. If you the covert operations out in a hostile community environment, it's all about being able to blend in. And obviously, if you're a male covert operator, you may be a lot less suspicious if you have a service woman with you. And there's a couple of books actually that are published by women who took these roles, which if you're interested, come and ask me, I can tell you more about those, but they give a really good idea of what that role was like at that time. So those are the kind of three areas of need for service women. What I talk about in my research and is about how that was in balance with the narrative that was constructed around why service women were there, and particularly this idea that they were non-combatants. So service women and there is inconsistency around this, it's not completely the case, but for much of the campaign, certainly into the 90s, and there was some variation with different units, but service women were largely unarmed, and they were also they were wearing skirts, and this was because it was thought that they would be less likely to be targeted. The IRA would be less likely to shoot them because of the backlash of shooting women, if that was in the press. So this allowed this narrative of the non-combatant to be sustained, and that was quite convenient to the British Army because that allowed them to portray the idea that, okay, we do need service women for all the reasons I just told you that they were needed, but at the same time, that's actually a bit of a threat to the front line as a traditionally kind of male domain, and therefore, in order for service women to be there in these roles, we need to make them acceptable in some way, and portraying them as non-combatants made them acceptable. So, moving on from that, just thinking about, I think it's very interesting, I just want to highlight how the visibility and the invisibility of service women made a difference. So, being out on patrol with the UDR, with the IUC, on conventional operations, obviously service women were visible, and that's why their presence there needed to be made acceptable in some way. But when you look at covert operations, obviously their presence didn't need to be known. You know, they were in civilian clothes, they're blending in. So service women, interestingly, had a much greater freedom in terms of they were armed from a much earlier time in the campaign, and they had much greater freedom in what they could do. Not quite the same as their male counterparts, but not far off. So that's just looking at how that initial kind of response and the need was balanced with this narrative around service women's presence. There's some really interesting contradictions, though, and kind of messy spaces around this. And I think one of the most interesting is around an example of the Foursquare laundry incident, which you may or may not have heard of, which was when the military reaction force, which was one of the early British Army kind of formations, I suppose, units, was doing operations that involved having running a laundry service, basically, in hostile kind of areas, well, in lots of different areas, but by gathering clothing and washing it, that was one source of intelligence, because if you're gathering more male shirts and they happen to be bloodstained, then you're getting a sense of how many people are in that house and what might be going on and what they might be involved with. And there's also intelligence gathering that was going on with the vehicle itself in terms of people, gathering intelligence as they conducted these patrols. And there's much more detail, there's much more complexity to this operation, but the bit that I wanted to point out is that there was a female lance corporal who was part of this, very much the visible front woman of this laundry service, and ultimately the cover of the operation was blown, and the male driver was killed. The lance corporal escaped from the scene, and there's some ambiguity over what exactly her actions were at that point, but she was nonetheless awarded a military medal for her actions. And what the most interesting point to me is not in what actually happened in that incident, but is in the response to it, because there is British Army documentation afterwards to say, you would think perhaps that there being a medal awarded, that there being this, that the Lance Corporal had responded in, like I say, slightly ambiguous as to the specific role. But and believe me, I've applied for the for the files, but they're not coming out. The British Army responded in making a decree, really, that service women couldn't be used in this way any longer, and ultimately had to be, so that did carry on. But I think it's the backlash to finding women in these positions. I have had a similar story told to me about someone in the RUC, so in the police, who returned fire when the men around her were killed and incapacitated to do so, and a similar sort of backlash in terms of sort of shocking realisation that the women who were unarmed had to respond in this way, and so backlashes that don't always fit these patterns and kind of challenge how we think about it. And just to quickly move on to talk briefly about the second question, how important were the security forces in bringing peace to Northern Ireland? For me, I think the question and the aspect that I wanted to talk about is around the legacy and the kind of knowledge that comes out of this campaign, in particular because I've looked at a longer history of British counterinsurgency and how the campaigns connect with each other. And I think that who gets to tell their story and where these archives reside is really important and is a form of military power over controlling the gender dynamics in the military. I think this sustains kind of contemporary military cultures, and elsewhere I write about how not having a complete military history that incorporates women's stories and looks at how they were left out in the first place. I think without these things, there's a lot that's lost from contemporary debates about culture and some of the deeply problematic cultures we have in the military right now. And to give one example that I think really links well between the campaign in Northern Ireland and more contemporary operations is around the lifting of the ban on women in ground close combat. So in the UK Armed Forces, this happened in 2018. Or from 2018 onwards, various bans were lifted that ultimately mean that all of the infantry and frontline roles are now open to women. But this is now used. You can look at women's military history and more contemporary history. It suggests this almost like the culmination of everything. Women have this history that we know about in the First and Second World War and their roles, and then through to, here we go, everything's now open, so it must all sort of be fine. If we look back at Northern Ireland, 30 years before these bans were lifted, women were on the front line, they were being shot at, they were, on these patrols day and night. So it's a complete, and that links into literature elsewhere, looking at other campaigns, that it really is a myth that women have not been on the front line for a much longer period of time. And I think it's drawing, across these campaigns, it's really important to hear these stories and allow them to help us to retell and just think about whose voices are heard and whose voices aren't heard. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks so much, Hannah. And I will pass over to Dan. It's still on, I think. Yes, Dan's going to give us his reflections.
Okay, guys. So obviously we're coming a little bit for Dr. Hugh Bennett tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'll start with the British Army and how they respond to the start of the conflict. I think then Thomas can do the second part of that question, and then I'll also do the Ulster Defence Regiment, which I normally specialise in. So it really can't be overstated. I mean, Dave did a fantastic, job at explaining how unprepared the British Army was going in, but it really cannot be overstated how unprepared they were. The British Army has mostly been engaged in colonial conflicts until now, so Aden, Malaya, and in those kind of conflicts you were far more able to do collective punishment, we'll call it, relocations, mass searches, etc., in a way that just was not going to fly in Northern Ireland, right? Being a Western liberal democracy, being with not more news cameras, etc., and the eyes on you, particularly American, stuff like that, this was not going to work. So they didn't know what they were doing when they were coming in. And that's a big thing I think you'll find throughout the story of the British experience in Northern Ireland. A constant adjustment to what is going on. I don't think there's a real clear plan until much later, not so in the first years of the conflict. So when the British Army comes in, there's a lot of evidence to suggest they did not take the provisional IRA, or the official IRA particularly, seriously. There's a good example of this. Brendan Hughes, who is later quite an influential member of the provisional IRA, told a story of how one night there was a clandestine secret training meeting of the IRA at the Falls Road, very nationalist area. And they're there getting weapons training, and they're there, all these guys, part of what the government recognises as a terrorist organisation, huddled around the table, when suddenly the door flings open. In steps a British officer who goes, "You right, lads? What weapon are we training on tonight?" And then shuts the door and leaves. Another member of the IRA recalled being trained on how to use a machine gun by a member of the intelligence corps. And there are many other stories like this of young soldiers training members of the IRA on how to use their rifles. That's how not seriously they were taken initially. That quickly changes. And the army then goes very much too far. The Falls Road curfew is a prime example. Mass search of houses. The hope was that by searching again the Falls Road, the same era Hughes had those training operations, those training meetings, they could apprehend men and material of the IRA. By the end of it, what they achieved was a few dead civilians, about 5 or 6 if I recall correctly, riots, shootings, and in the end, the IRA was seen as more legitimate. It had grown their support. Failure. Next, then you have events, like internment again, prime example internment. Mass detention without trial. Cannot again be overstated how bad this has got. That's not to say everything they did was wrong, and everything they did was a strategic failure. Operation Motorman was very good for reassuring the public. We will be able to restore order to the streets. We will be able to safeguard you and your interests. But stuff like internment was awful. And Hugh was here telling you, read his book, it's fantastic. And one of the bits that always stood out to me was how when the orders went around to round up people for internment, the then Prime Minister of Northern Ireland got to sign off on those orders. And on several of them were the words, anti-Northern Irish government sentiment. You protest the government? Congrats, have fun in jail for a few years. And that was allowed, right? That happened. So the British Army, doesn't know about this, but it carries those orders out, as it is, duty bound to do. But it engages in going too far. The same with the massacres. It is too heavy-handed in the early years, and ultimately, therefore, it is not in a position to understand what is going on. So in the first part of the years, the army does its best, but ultimately, it's constantly seen to be going, let's take the gloves off a little bit. And that is just a failure. That's not the way things should have been done. And as you'll see throughout the whole narrative of the conflict, when things do get better, you begin to see how awful those first approaches were. Now, in support of the army, and this is where my expertise really lies, is the creation of the Ulster Defence Regiment. And the Ulster Defence Regiment is an invaluable tool in the arsenal of the British Army. It's brought in to replace an irregular police force, the Ulster Special Constabulary, some of whom took part in the Burntullett riot, assaulting members of the NICRA, the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association. So it's brought in to replace that, because also that's been discredited. It's long been seen, the B Specials as they're referred to, as a Protestant militia designed to put down the Catholics, put down the Nationalists, put down the Republicans. So the UDR is brought in to replace this, to be an armed wing of the local military, so the local military unit, to support what would be then the disarmed RUC. The Irish disarm, UDR steps in as local part-time soldiers to support them. And the UDR is incredibly under-resourced when it comes online. We've already talked about the radios. I know of one battalion that was forced to set up in the back of lorries, some of which were bin lorries. So where's the battalion base? It's in the back of that bin lorry. Have fun. Cracking, you can imagine that, the back opens up, you step in the back of a bin lorry, probably used, I imagine. And that's where you're operating an entire group of hundreds of men from. This is how underprepared the Reg was. Another individual who gave his story to another author recounted that his promotion to sergeant, he had to shoot about 10 bullets downrange. Congrats, you're a sergeant. Crack on. Another one I spoke to said that his training for the UDR, because he was so under-resourced, because he needed to get online and get on the streets, was he had less time in training and firing than he did when he was in the Army Cadets as a kid. That's how rapid things are having to come online. And they do an incredible job, right, the UDR. Right, they're helping to police the streets, to secure them, to reassure people, to allow people a way to participate in the security crisis. And that cannot be understated how important that is. Okay? They are there helping to safeguard streets and town centres by sitting on main roads, mounting checkpoints, doing searches, right? And their ability to understand stuff is really, really important in those first years. They are a massive boon of support for the army, and one that is greatly appreciated by British soldiers in those first years. Again, they're not perfect, that's not, and no one would claim they would be, but they do conduct a very important role in those first few years. Sadly, those first few years, they are infiltrated. They are recruiting for local communities. That's where the terrorists are. So they are infiltrated by members of both sides, we know this, but particularly people called loyalist paramilitaries, those who are fighting in illegal militias to safeguard their interests and remain part of the United Kingdom because it suits them. And these individuals steal weaponry, steal intelligence, and kill people. All right, there are instances in which people dressed up as the UDR or who are from the UDR engage in acts of violence. Now, let me be abundantly clear about this. This is the popular narrative of the UDR. It is a overly focused narrative of the UDR. I did the research, I'll tell you now, it was a problem, absolutely. But if you read the books, it's nowhere as dominating of the regiment as you think it is. It makes it sound like everyone is at it. It's not. It's a very small subsection who committed awful crimes. And I'm sure if you ask Dave about this, he'll tell you how much the UDR projects them, wants every single one of them to have their day in court and face justice, right? But otherwise, the UDR does a fantastic job in those first years, and they get better and better. They are under-resourced in the first years, but by the end of the conflict, going to part 2, the UDR is a crucial element in bringing about peace. Regular soldiers rotate in, rotate out. A year or two at most, or 6 months, you're out, gone. That means the next bunch brought in, yes, they've got the papers, they might have the training, but they don't have the experience, perhaps, of serving in Northern Ireland. The UDR do. They live it, they breathe it. They're able to offer that continuity. So much so that regular battalions, including the Grenadier Guards, which isn't some low-level scene, not very well respected regiment, it's a highly respected regiment within the British Army. They recommend that more duties and tasks be given over to the UDR. And they're not the only ones, this happens in 7 different regiments. This went great, that went great, the UDR are fantastic, give them more to do. Okay? And these are in private after-action reports and post-war reports. These are not designed for the public, all right? So they're being quite honest, okay? So they are fantastic at doing that. They are able to find thousands of pounds of bombs, explosives, thousands of rounds of ammo, intercept and arrest people who are engaging in wrongdoing, in our occasion, if you're lucky. They are able to do so much of just the basic job of reassuring the public and carrying on with daily life, allowing them to do so. And that is a great personal risk and personal loss. I think, David will obviously know the exact figures off the top of his head, I think it's 196 last I checked of the UDR soldiers lost their lives according to official records. I may be wrong on that. 79% of those, men and women, lost their lives, 79%, whilst off duty. So whilst at home with friends and loved ones, right in the back, not while in uniform, they got killed, they got murdered at home from people they love. And that's a big thing about local forces. These two gentlemen will say they put their lives under threat, and David was hunted, pretty much, you want to think about it that way. For 20 years, as a UDR member, he could expect for 20 odd years to have been hunted by a member of the IRA. You cannot afford to go to parties, birthdays, anything at all. If you make a pattern, you are a dead man. That is the rule. Can you imagine living through that? I could not. And these thousands of people do this, and some of them are killed after they serve. So I remember a story, by the time this narrative became apparent, of another of my interviewees who said, on my first proper day on base, the training major took us to a room, there was a curtain in the middle of the room. We all sat there going, what's going on? The curtain opens, and there's a coffin. He said, right lads, I am the training major. My other duty is arranging funerals. If things happen, I will, collect your body, we'll do all the services, we'll dress you right, and I will help your family with burying you. This is something you all face. If you wish to leave now, go. Because once you're in, you never get out of this regiment. Not really. And that was true, because when he left, and 10 years after he left, he began to receive, for 10 years, death threats. The IRA know who you are, the IRA are coming, they're going to kill you. So it doesn't end there. But these people persevere despite this and provide a very valuable service to the government. They are there on the streets, taking danger, at home, on duty, taking risks, finding bombs, saving lives, doing what needs to be done. Okay? In spite of those few of them who are giving them a bad name in the press, and the press widely just seems to condemn them any opportunity they get. And that's how the histories go about it. There's very little on the UDR. I'm one of the few authors to write on the UDR, and as far as I'm aware, I'm the only one who does a massive text on it, who is an academic. Everyone else is a journalist or has written bits and bobs on one aspect or the other. I'm the only cross-UDR expert as far as I'm aware, because of that whole narrative. It's a very widely overlooked and understudied phenomenon. But their contribution is fantastic. They are there to help restore peace, and at the end of the conflict, they obviously have been rebranded out to the Royal Irish Regiment, and they are done away with essentially. But they do have a really important aspect of it. And again, and you can ask me more about this, I'm happy to talk to you about it because I'm aware of time, but they provide an invaluable service. And again, just ask David, he'll tell you some fantastic stories. And there are some really important elements that I'll get to as well in questions, because I want to talk to you a bit more about the question section about this loyalist element and the allowing people to serve in the righteous sort of legal way as opposed to an illegal way. And again, we'll bring up the question because we're aware of the time.
Great, okay, so many thanks for the contributions. So, I'm going to be quick. My work's looked at both British and Irish security forces. When I say Irish security forces, I've looked specifically about how the Irish government deals with conflict legacy, but a key element of that is obviously looking at the Irish security forces during the conflict. So I'll cover both pretty briefly. Right, start the conflict. We've already talked tonight about how British overt security operations up to 1972 in the conflict just essentially radicalised further Irish nationalist support for the IRA. And I keep using that word, like a sizeable minority of the Irish Catholic community in Northern Ireland backed the IRA. We can see that in the 80s and 90s because Sinn Féin's vote, they roughly win in Northern Ireland as well, as some of you might know if you're on my course, etc. Generally, Irish Catholics do not vote Ulster Unionist British Protestant parties and vice versa. So we know roughly in the 80s, okay, Sinn Féin wins, the Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA, wins what? About 10-12% of the vote in Northern Ireland, but what we're really looking at is them versus the other, in this case, the party that's not engaged in armed conflict, SDLP, other than being an observer to that, and they're winning about 40% of the Irish Catholic vote overall. My point with that would be, and I said I'm not going to go further into that, we talked about that, British overt security operations like Bloody Sunday, internment at the beginning of the conflict. What I think is key for that is those actions early on gave the IRA enough core support to probably sustain itself indefinitely. So that although the actions might have been remedied by things later on, or changed, you don't carry out that kind of overt, non-discriminatory security measures again, I think the damage is done in terms of giving the IRA enough core support to sustain itself. So that's on that. With the Irish security forces at the start of the conflict, they didn't face the same level of threat as in Northern Ireland. I mean, John mentioned that it was a different kind of level of threat that they were facing. So, with that, interestingly, so the provisional IRA, the IRA we're primarily talking about tonight, in its, what was it called? General Army Convention, so these were like General Army Orders, and with list things their volunteers could and could not do. And one of the things it listed, in theory, was forbidding armed actions against An Garda Síochána, the Irish police and the Irish Defence Forces. But if we look at the reasons for that, that's not because the IRA and Sinn Féin support the Irish state, they did not. Actually quite the reverse. I mean, if we look at that in a kind of practical sense, Sinn Féin actually stopped its members, if elected, from taking seats in Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament, until 1986. They didn't actually remove that ban on abstaining from the Irish Parliament, because in the view of Sinn Féin and the IRA, the southern state, as they called it, was partitionist with the British government. It was a partitionist state, which they didn't back. In reality, so why didn't they kind of en masse target the Irish security forces? Because they accepted that most Southern Irish citizens supported their government and security forces. Begrudgingly, but they accepted that to an extent. Having said that, and there's a big having said that, that doesn't mean that no Irish security forces were targeted by the IRA, because they were. So Irish Gardaí and Irish Defence Force personnel did die at the hands of Irish Republican groups, one of them being the IRA. Nonetheless, the Irish state, I think, recognised quite early on that the IRA, and John talked about this, was an enemy of the Irish state. And I would actually say like it was the principal enemy when it came to the Northern conflict. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and I think because the IRA's vision for unification was to end the existence of both states, the northern state and the southern state, and set up what it wanted was a socialist united republic. That's what it exclaimed in its ideology. So you see this in some readings like Patterson or Rowe's reading. I think they're right on this, that the Irish government essentially saw the IRA as a left-wing ideological but also just generalised security threat to their state. And I think the kind of primary fear for the Irish government and state was perceived as risking a civil war in the north, spiralling down south, coming down south of the border. And in the 70s, I know me and John, I think we were talking about this earlier, the Irish state wanted to look instead to Europe building its economy. There was a European Economic Community, today we call it the EU, it's slightly different than that, but it was bringing together a European community politically and economically. The Irish state wanted to concentrate on that for the benefit of its economy. It did not want to concentrate on this conflict in the north. So, at first I think in the Irish state it was difficult to act against the IRA. Again, John talked about this, because there was a level of sympathy with public opinion because of the discrimination that they felt Northern nationalists, so Irish Catholics living in Northern Ireland, faced from unionism, and anger also towards the British government following some of the things we talked about tonight, internment, Bloody Sunday, etc. I think what altered Irish public opinion in the majority were IRA actions there in the Republic, including robberies or killing of individual Gardaí. I think there was a fear of a civil war for the Irish public as well, if they got any kind of political engagement in what was going on in terms of supporting Republicans. There was censorship of the IRA in the Republic from quite early on in the conflict, from 1972, and there was a distance from Northern Ireland as well. And that goes back to getting in a headspace for where Irish politicians, but also society, was looking about building their economy, integrating and becoming part of Europe. The IRA in its campaign was not; it was a threat to that essentially. By diverting resources. Now, against Ulster loyalist paramilitaries, so Protestant British paramilitaries, and John has touched on this, talking about the Dublin Monaghan bombings, and overall I would say the Irish government's efforts were insufficient. I mean, John says this in his work as well. Loyalists are alleged, alongside collusive elements within British security forces, to have carried out attacks on Irish civilians. So the standout one we talked about tonight, Dublin Monaghan bombings, May 1974, kills 34 people. And when you put that in context, that actually represents the highest number of people killed in single incidents together in a single day of the whole conflict. And it happened with Dublin Monaghan bombings. And we saw Judge Barron's report for the Irish government in the mid-2000s to look into why was no one ever convicted for this. He suspected there was elements of collusion in this. And the archives show the Irish government got hints from the British government about who might be responsible, and John knows this, he's written this in his work, who might be responsible for these bombings in 1975. And if we put it, I wouldn't say politely, but in general terms, they did not act on that information. And I'd argue really, loyalists, what's worrying about that is actually loyalists could have potentially done the same thing again, because I think the Irish state did not equally focus on the loyalist Protestant paramilitary threat to its state, and the government specifically with that. In terms of peace process, with British security intelligence efforts, so my first book, accepted they had some success against the IRA. So you see things such as the SAS killing multiple East Tyrone IRA members, one of the IRA units, from 1987, and then you had things like the agent State Knife within the IRA's internal security unit, hunting informers, whose name now is quite widely known, so I don't have to say it. But I don't think evidence suggests, from my own work, the IRA was forced into peace. I don't think that was the case. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, in its units in the cities, so Derry and Belfast, it adopted a kind of small cell structure after 1975, and I generally think that helped them to persist. In rural areas, with the exception of Tyrone, the small, tight-knit IRA units persisted for the IRA going into the 1990s. So a standout example of that is a place called South Armagh, right by the border, where the IRA prevented, for example, vehicle patrols and were involved in high-profile attacks there and elsewhere. And I also don't think the IRA leadership were significantly infiltrated. And the way we can kind of test this is like high-profile operations that the IRA was carrying out in England. So the IRA leadership would have been involved in picking members for those kind of things. Attacks on Downing Street in the 1990s, and attacking Margaret Thatcher and the Brighton Hotel bombing in 1984. Other examples of that, most Libyan weapons shipments arrived for the IRA in the late 1980s, and there was an interception of the last one. But that, for me, kind of suggests the available evidence suggests the IRA could persist in this campaign. It couldn't win, but it could persist in what it was doing, and certainly had the arsenal, if you want to call it that, to do that. And I think, overall, that what they essentially, I think the leadership, there's a distinction here. The leadership of the movement, I think, is the conflict war on, wanted a settlement that included some form of acceptance of all Ireland self-determination, loosely defined, because that could be negotiated in talks. And I think, to an extent they achieved that. I also think, approximately about 40% of the Irish Catholic community in Northern Ireland were voting Sinn Féin by the time you get to the 1990s. So if you create a political settlement without that much of the Irish Catholic community, essentially just weren't going to have peace. I also think some of the, the intelligence operations, like the steak knife case, I mean, there was an independent police inquiry released 2020, independent report, not police, because the head person who did it, John Boucher, is now head of the police in Northern Ireland, that's why I got confused. But 2024, that was released, and it accepted that, this agent, steak knife, actually raised more questions for the British state in terms of how some of its intelligence assets, etc., were operating. If we then look at the Republic of Ireland, finally, and I agree with John's point, with the resources available, I think the Irish security forces, they did their utmost against the IRA, generally. I'm not convinced the IRA, certainly by about the mid-1980s, was going to significantly threaten the South militarily anyway as a tactic. And what I mean by that is ever try and have armed means to remove or overthrow the government of Dublin. I don't think that's what they were looking at. But I also think, there's a difference as well in emphasis. So I think the Irish government and the security forces generally saw by the 80s anyway, this was a political issue to solve this conflict. It wasn't necessarily just going to be a security one. So they realised a peace process was needed. And I think partly that view emerged because the electoral rise of Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, so the Irish government again realised they're not going to go away. And I think the IRA persistence kind of got them into that view as well. I think at times the Irish government, probably did bargain greater security cooperation with the British in exchange for reforms in the north for nationalists there, or in exchange for British injustices such as Birmingham's 6 persons wrongfully convicted. The Irish government wanted them reviewed. So I did think, it probably did barter over security cooperation. But that was the Irish government and state reiterating their view, particularly to Margaret Thatcher's government, onwards there's not going to be a security solution to the conflict, which I think was right with the view they took on that. So anyway, I think, in some of this, I think the Irish government and security forces were important in helping to bring about the peace process. I think that would be true. I don't think the Irish state paid enough attention to the loyalist threat from the 1970s onwards. So there are examples of things they did do was successful. So, the Irish security forces were quite quick to act when former Democratic Unionist Party leader Peter Robinson and loyalists invaded, if you want to call it that, Clontrebet in Monaghan in 1986, and they were arrested. But I do feel, there's somewhat a level of fortune that some Dublin Monaghan type attack didn't happen again, because I think there were deficits in knowledge on loyalism. I also just think, my research interviews with different Irish UK politicians, security personnel, victims groups, does suggest that, the Irish state would face some justifiable criticisms for specific excessive security actions by individuals. So, for example, the Salons train robbery and what were called heavy gang allegations in the 1970s about suspects being allegedly forced into convictions by individual interrogators. On conflict legacy generally, I do think the Irish government's addressed some of these things. It's tried to with Dublin Monaghan a little bit too late, really, after 2000s, but other things are overlooked. So essentially, mixed picture. I do think politics was really the key to ending the conflict, north and south. Anyway, okay, so that leaves us, let's say, 10-15 minutes just for questions.
So my first question, is there any correlation between the attempt and after the policy that was implemented, a shoot-to-kill policy? And can we say that it's become a focusing event? So is that turning point for the British government to be more aggressive, use more, be tough? So, do you think a shoot-to-kill policy has a huge impact on disrupting the IRA?
How effective the British security sort of structures were working with the Garda, because it doesn't seem like many of the British ones are very good with working with each other at times.
Was there a lack of will in Northern Ireland which allowed this to extend over 30 years? And was it a failure of politics, or was it a failure of security? I think it builds on some of the questions about shoot to kill, whether perhaps the security not aggressive enough to bring sides to the negotiating table.
Great, thanks very much. Let's go, John.
Thank you very much. Very interesting question. How, I'm going to put it in colloquial terms, how well did the British security services in MI5 and MI6 get on with the guards? Yeah, is that okay? Now, from my point of view, and I have many friends in the British security services, they treat us with wonderful, loving kindness. But of course they have an agenda. The object of every country's security service, the BURR, is to advance the interests of your own country. Yeah? And there's been cooperation on a whole range of things. I referred earlier on to the technical capacity of the British state. And when you talk about, like if you talk simply just about people, and who's the head of MI5 or MI6, or who is operating the Force Research Unit, or who's in charge of whatever. But the British state is a corporate security state at a very significant level. At the very top of that, and sorry for rambling on, is the Cabinet Office, where you have a Joint Intelligence Committee, which brings in all of the elements of the security apparatus, which is the Ministry of Defence, DCHQ, Defence Intelligence, SOS, Security Service MI5, Special Branch Units, and then when you bring it down to Northern Ireland, you have security-related units, your tasking and coordinating units, MI5, IOC, Special Branch, you had SAS and the Fourth Intelligence Company, and FRU. So, this is a very complex thing, but on very many, let's call this almost like a Donald Trumpian thing. On a transactional basis, there was very good cooperation. On a strategic basis, I would say, both politically and otherwise, it really depended on who was the number 10, or who was sitting in Leinster House, or who was the key political dynamic installment, if there was one. So, but on an individual basis, and there's one classic example, is the real IRA, who were the people responsible for the Omagh bombing. Their leader was a guy called McKevitt, and his organisation, the real IRA, were infiltrated by a combination of the FBI and MI6, MI5. I was getting confused. And in cooperation with the guards, Michael McKevitt was tried in Dublin, and he got the single longest sentence for organising terrorism. But incidentally, and often the legal and security actions happen after an atrocity rather than in anticipation of the pre-existing circumstances. He got something like 25 years, he's now dead. He was the guy who tried to bring he had been the quartermaster of the Provisional IRA, in other words, he knew where the bombs were, and he had a whole infrastructure right throughout the country, north and south. So in that case, there was great cooperation, but I was close enough to it at the time. And both the British security services and the FBI were very reluctant to divulge that they were holding an ace, which was this guy David Rupert, who had infiltrated the real IRA. But eventually, the only place where McKevitt could be tried was in the Republic. And then there was a trial under new legislation. He was convicted. So yes, transactional rather than strategic, would be the way I would describe it.
Great. David, any questions?
Okay, yeah. I'll be a little bit flippant on the shoot to kill thing, first of all. Pamphlet number 1 in the British Army is entitled Shoot to Kill. Why? Because any time you're going to use a firearm, you're only going to use it for that purpose. You will always only shoot to kill. You never shoot to wound, you aim for the central body mass, and you shoot to kill. So every soldier is taught to shoot to kill. Okay. Now, that's a little bit flippant on that, but was there a correlation between the attempt on Margaret Thatcher's life and a more stringent, more aggressive policy? No. It certainly made her resolve more steely and she was going to stay in the game for a lot longer and all the rest of it. You mentioned Loughgall, Operation Duty, in which 9 or 8 Provisional IRA members of the East Tyrone Brigade were killed. Let me give you just a little bit of the background to that, because everything in Northern Ireland is dictated by events. A campaign had been ongoing for some considerable time where the IRA were bombing police stations, typically what were called limited opening police stations. These police stations were manned only for a few hours a day, things like that there. They bombed them and destroyed them. And some months before Loughgall, Rich Hill Police Station had been bombed and destroyed. Plum Bridge Police Station had been bombed and nearly destroyed. That in itself was a bad thing. However, where the IRA got really clever and followed up on this was they intimidated and threatened and killed any contractors who were going to be employed by the government to repair or rebuild those police stations. And what happened then was contractors just didn't want to know. And but for the bravery of 1 or 2 contractors, Jim Henry of Henry Brothers and Turkington, which became Carl Construction later, and McLaughlin Harvey. If they hadn't stuck by it, the IRA would have had a considerable victory, because they would have just kept destroying police stations that were never going to be rebuilt, and it would have been not just an embarrassment, but it would have been a significant victory. So it couldn't continue. There was massive amount of resource and effort put into protecting those few contractors that were there. We set up an operation where they could make their concrete behind army barracks and things like this here. They were guarded as they worked. But it had to be stopped. And when the intelligence came through that there was going to be another police station destroyed in the same way, and they didn't know it was going to be Loughgall. It was going to be one of 3 stations. It happened to be Loughgall. The SAS were put in, along with specially trained police, and they opened up on terrorists who opened fire first, who exploded a 500-pound bomb first, and then wondered why they were killed. Thomas mentioned the so-called Green Book, is what you're referring to, the convention. It states, this is when anyone joins the IRA, again, all people wishing to join the army, that's the IRA, must fully realise that when life has been threatened, that very well could mean their own. If you go out to shoot soldiers or police, you must fully realise that they too can shoot you. So, anybody in the IRA went in with eyes open. The reason why more of those operations that you referred to, which typically involved the SAS, but not exclusively, there were things like the RUC's E4A and other units, was that the intelligence was getting better and more accurate, and they were getting a little bit towards the front foot with the IRA. So they were taking them on. It was the first opportunity to really take them on. It was successful in suppressing certainly the East Tyrone Brigade. Thomas argues about the further success of how much that infiltrated into the mindset of the leadership of the IRA, and that's up for debate. But that's a little bit of background into that. It was an indication of the army and the government trying to get more on the front foot and to suppress as far as possible, and it was intelligence led. To pick up on the other point, the 30-year events, and that's as simple as I would put it. Every time you started to get close to something, an event happens, and it doesn't take much in Northern Ireland to upset. A flag flying in the wrong place will soon upset and cause good negotiations that have taken years, weeks, months, whatever to happen. Events primarily, political will wasn't always there as well. So it's a mixture of all that.
Great.
Thomas, if I may, just one quick,
Yeah,
if I may. Sorry. Yeah, the key point is that I want to emphasise the importance of back channels. Because while it's easy to see this as kind of a left-right struggle on military terms, and of course it was that, and you can see the obvious sign. But you have to ask yourself why, right throughout the entire troubles of 72 on, back channels were established with the IRA. And the people who led the IRA, like Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, prospered right into the very top of the political echelon in the north. And they did that in a way that they also got kind of grudging acceptance worldwide. Even the Queen shook hands with Martin McGuinness, the man who decided whether you lived or died. You know, so this is not just a symmetrical conflict where you have the good guys over here and the bad guys over here. There are many nuances on it. And the intelligence part of it, the back channels. Also, just hand back to Mike in a second, I have to mention the role of double agents. I mean, Steak Knife Freddie Scappaticci was a British Army agent inside the nutting squad, the killing squad of the IRA. Now, it's often when we talk about agents, they exist within a structure that recognises them as being a valuable asset. I mean, they are not like solo individuals who are operating, today I'll go to do X, Y, and Z. They exist within the structure. So, the last point I make is, of course, that if a conflict is a military conflict, it's perfectly acceptable, I guess, in military doctrine that you take out the bad guys on the other side. The word that's used now, I think, on your television screen would be, we neutralise A, B, and C. And that's perfectly acceptable. It's not a moral judgment, but a tactical judgment to do that. Whereas if something is a policing conflict, much as I would have liked to do it occasionally, you can't neutralise the people on the other side. So there's a mix of what is a military and a policing conflict, and it's almost like a hybrid conflict. And it is a mistake, I think, and I say this respectfully, to look at the Northern Ireland situation of trouble simply as a military conflict. Of course it was that, but there was also many other aspects to it. So just hopefully that clarifies some of my thinking on it. Maybe that'll help you, but yeah, just to share it.
Great. Who's going next? Dan or Hannah? Don't mind.
Yeah, so looking at sort of the, I think the question was raised, why didn't it kind of end a little sooner and stuff like that. I think we need to realise that there were obviously many attempts, and I'm not an expert on this, but there's many attempts to end the conflict earlier. One of the most infamous is in 1974, I believe, with Sunningdale, and it brings in many measures that actually will be repeated in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement. But the loyalist paramilitary aspect society is not willing or open to that. And they do the UWC strike. They bring down the Sunningdale Agreement. So there are early attempts. There are attempts to go along with this. So the Degree 3, the Sunningdale, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and the Good Friday Agreement. And all Sunningdale is basically is a trial almost of what happens in the Good Friday Agreement. But at that point, the loyalists just aren't on side. And this is quite early in the conflict, you know. There's lots going on. There's different bits and bobs. And I've had a famous quote just being said by David, the Sunningdale for Slow Learners quote about the Good Friday Agreement. That's what it was in reality. And that's certainly true. And that's because these elements of society didn't believe they were beaten. They could get along with it. They could make things go back to the way they were for the loyalists. But by the 80s and 90s, people are tired of it. And that's the big thing. By the 1990s, the same people who are saying, we're not going to have Sunningdale, we're going to keep going, these loyalist paramilitaries are pushing for peace, whilst their arguable political representation, people who they've agreed with most throughout the conflict, the DUP, you could argue, we're saying carry on, essentially. We're not open to the Good Friday Agreement in its current format. So the same people who bring it down in 74 are the ones leading the charge in their community in 1998. So that's a big part of it. It's not everybody is open to it at the same time. So yeah, there are attempts earlier.
Yeah, super. Thanks again, just picking up on the will to end the conflict question. I just wanted to draw attention to women's will to end the conflict. I wouldn't want to homogenise women and suggest that there was one perspective, this was one united cohort. There were women as part of the paramilitaries, there were women in all the different aspects that we've talked about today. But nonetheless, women did form part of the early back channels that John was talking about to the IRA, something that I've been tentatively, slowly looking into. There were also a number of significant and publicly, in the public domain, huge women's movements, often cross-community movements, which look to bring the conflict to an end, often triggered by the killing of civilians, particularly children and families. And they were quite symbolic moments during the campaign, but didn't necessarily hold for longer periods of time and bring about any earlier kind of end. But I think if this is an area that anyone's sort of interested in finding out more about, I think those women's movements culminate in the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, which goes forward into the Northern Ireland Assembly, the talks and then the Assembly. There's a really good book written by Kate Fearon, who was part of the coalition, and I really recommend that to learn a bit more about their influence, both in bringing those different communities together to have have women at the table of the talks, but also their perspective on what it was like to be a part of those talks as a cross-community group and influencing the other people around the table.
Great. And then just finally from me, some thoughts on this before I wrap up for ourselves. On the targeted killing point, I mean, you know this because we talk in my office about this. I would just say, I'm not going to get into whether it's a policy or not. What I would say, even the East Tyrone IRA, I mean, is, certainly my own work, like it had an attritional effect and knocked out some people who were carrying out attacks and helped over time, I would say over 4 or 5 years, probably, some element of containment of like the East Tyrone IRA. In terms of whether it had, I'm just going to look at the effective question. I'm not sure. I think in the short term, it removed some people from circulation who were problematic. I think in the case of the Loughgall incident, some of the people who were prison escapees as well. So I think there was an element potentially of, well, you've already been warned. So I think that might have partly explained some of the things that happened there. But I think, even in East Tyrone, or Tyrone as a county, if you look at Sinn Féin's vote in local council elections going into the 90s, it's actually, in rural areas, it's one of their higher number of councillor areas. They managed to sustain it. So the point I'm making with that is this, and I know your study looks at that when we look at it as a wider lesson about if you remove certain people in certain areas, can you, cut the head off a snake? I don't think so in the case of East Tyrone, because East Tyrone wasn't the IRA. There's various units to it. I mean, we don't see the same kind of thing going on in South Armagh, some of its units in North Armagh, etc. So, and also, I think sometimes the overuse of it probably would be my view in the SAS, what happens in the 80s into early 90s. You get an element of martyrdom of the people who are killed as well. I mean, if you look at the ones who were killed in, I think it's Clonoy in the 1992 ambush, I mean, some of these people are 17, 18 years of age, and certainly some accounts are saying they're inspired by the people who were killed at Loughgall. So, I don't necessarily think it was instrumental in bringing the IRA to the peace table at all, because again, I think political factors are more important. The last point about failure of politics, possibly, and I think that would be on all sides. I think there were periods in the conflict where the British government perhaps didn't attempt to bring about peace talks that involved all sides, even if that looked unrealistic in particular periods. So I'm specifically talking about late 70s Labour government, 1980s, most of Thatcher's time in government, and there are obviously reasons for the hunger strikes. I think both sides thereafter, particularly the IRA and British government, was going to be difficult, and obviously things like the Brighton bomb had to do that. But it my own view on it is the Republican leadership would have been looking for peace talks. Now, whether they could have carried that with Margaret Thatcher, I don't know, with their own movement because of things that happened with the hunger strikes. I'd also say, the Irish government, SDLP, I think the Irish government had an element of this as well into the 80s. I think it only, from what we can see in records, I mean, the Irish government would speak to Protestant paramilitaries in the 70s. It didn't make much effort really to try and at least talk to the IRA and see if there's ways they could help to negotiate an end to the conflict. once it did that with the SDLP in the mid-80s, I think that gave a momentum to the peace process, trying to convince the IRA to not use its armed methods anymore. Yeah, so I think it applies to all sides. Unionists as well. I think there was an element of stubbornness with the two parties of refusing to try and move to a political settlement, which weirdly with some Protestant paramilitaries wasn't there. I think some of their ideas were quite far-reaching in the late 70s and 80s. Even things about, could Northern Ireland become an independent state within the Commonwealth? I'm not saying those things would have worked, but they were trying to think, how could they integrate a political solution that would be appealing to the Northern Nationalist community? Yeah, but that would be my thought on that. Anyway, okay, so we're keeping you from your dinner or beds or pub, whatever the plan is this evening. I want to just thank, first of all, GW4, you'll see up in there, they fund all our events for the network, and we'll have some more events in the next couple of weeks about politics in Northern Ireland since 1998, and we'll have some guest speakers, potentially some politicians as well. So, hope you found tonight engaging.
Thomas, may I just?
Yes, of course.
Maybe for the academics, you'd like to kind of give us the reason why Provisional Sinn Féin is now headed by two women. Is this an evolution of a different kind? Yeah, it's a very interesting, because Provisional IRA were led by macho guys who shot you in the head and said, if you're an informer, you should die. Now, the president of Sinn Féin is Mary Lou MacDonald, the first minister, am I correct in terminology, in Northern Ireland, is Michelle O'Neill. Now, how come that a macho killing organisation now led by women? There you go.
Oh, great question. Yeah.
No, I don't mean for now.
Yeah, I think it's maybe one for dinner,
later.
but,
I mean, my only thoughts with that would be, what's interesting there, if you compare to like Protestant paramilitaries, is that they're, and students will know this in my class, if we can do the question on women and the conflict with Irish Republicans, this can be very useful. I would say, and it's a really good question on it, probably because they link themselves to like liberation, left-wing movements across the globe. When you look at some of the organisations they're aligned with.
But how did the men let go?
Well, I think over time, if you look at things for mainly like left-wing organisations and parties, like women's rights and emancipation has become a big theme.
Yeah.
So I think just over time, that's happened, and there's the evolution of the movement where women have taken over. So I think it's, for that, I don't necessarily think that's like a Northern Ireland specific thing with republicanism. I think it's like a global trend with left-wing movements. That's probably where that's come out of overall. But that's my only thinking on it. Okay, so I just want to thank all panel members, John, David, Hannah and Dan, for coming along and speaking this evening, and also yourselves for bearing with us and sticking with us this evening. And I hope it's been an insightful discussion. The videos that are recorded, they're put on our website. So again, if you're students or staff or anyone else you're interested, you can use it in your work and cite it, etc. Yes, so they were. But anyway, thanks very much for coming along tonight. Nos waith, good night, and thanks again. Come.